but I feel that I could do the part if she'd give me a chance and trust me. She reminded me of that tonight.
Few people know that behind the dazzling success of the legendary TV show Good Times, the relationship between Esther Rolle, the exemplary mother figure on screen, and Jimmie Walker, the rebellious comedian, was fraught with tension. On screen, they portrayed a warm family, but in real life, Esther Rolle almost entirely despised her co-star. Why would an actress celebrated for her kindness, strict professionalism, and unwavering dedication to the craft adopt such a resolute stance? And what truly unfolded behind the scenes that led this television icon to oppose the script and even directly confront Jimmie Walker? Join us as we uncover the secrets, the real reason Esther Rolle couldn't accept Jimmie, and how this controversy shook Hollywood to its core at the time. To grasp why Esther Rolle reached a breaking point in her professional relationship with Jimmie Walker, a conflict so sharp it has been described as outright hostility, one must first understand who she was, not merely as an actress, but as a cultural force. Born in 1920 in the modest town of Pompano Beach, Florida, Esther Rolle grew up in a world where opportunities for African American women were painfully scarce. Yet, even in an environment shaped by segregation and limited horizons, she carried within her a quiet determination, a belief that art could do more than entertain. It could challenge perceptions, uplift communities, and carve a space for dignity where little had been offered before. Rolle was not simply drawn to acting for fame or glamour. Instead, she saw it as a vehicle for truth-telling, for reshaping the narrative of Black life on screen, and for demanding that the American audience confront realities often ignored. Her journey into the arts took her to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York City, where she honed her craft in an environment both demanding and exhilarating. Unlike many of her contemporaries who sought only the applause of Broadway, Rolle invested her energy in the authenticity of performance. She was meticulous, almost scholarly in her preparation, approaching each role with a deep sense of responsibility. It wasn't just about memorizing lines. It was about embodying history, representing voices too often silenced, and bringing to light the humanity within characters who, in lesser hands, might have been reduced to stereotypes. Broadway was her proving ground. The stage sharpened her instincts and gave her the tools to merge discipline with passion. Audiences and critics alike began to take notice of her intensity, a performer who carried gravitas not through flamboyance but through presence. She was, as colleagues often remarked, a woman who brought weight to every production she touched. Yet even with such achievements, Broadway remained a relatively closed circle, and the larger recognition that Rolle deserved did not fully materialize until she made the leap into the world of television. It was in the small screen arena that Esther Rolle truly ignited. The timing was pivotal. The 1970s television landscape was beginning to wrestle with questions of race, representation, and the shifting dynamics of American society. For decades, African American characters had been confined to marginal or caricatured roles, maids, comic relief, or background figures. Rolle entered television with a mission: to dismantle that tradition and replace it with something richer, more complex, and infinitely more authentic. By 1974, Esther Rolle's moment of destiny had arrived. When she was cast as Florida Evans in Good Times, it was not just another acting job. It was a cultural appointment. Television had offered her a platform larger than Broadway, and with it came a chance to shape how millions of Americans understood Black family life. Rolle knew the stakes instinctively. To her, Florida Evans was never simply a fictional mother. She was the heartbeat of a community, a portrait of resilience under relentless pressure, and perhaps most importantly, a corrective to decades of stereotypes that had reduced Black women on screen to subservient roles or comic punchlines. Florida Evans, as written, was the matriarch of a family living in a Chicago housing project. But in Rolle's hands, the character expanded into something iconic. She was stern but loving, weary yet unbreakable, a mother who balanced humor with hard truths. Rolle infused her with dignity and spiritual depth, qualities rooted in her own upbringing in Florida as the daughter of Bahamian immigrants. "I didn't just play Florida Evans," she would later remark in interviews. "I lived her." The role resonated immediately with audiences. Black families across the United States saw themselves reflected in a way that felt both intimate and revolutionary. For the first time, primetime television gave them a character who did not apologize for her blackness, who did not shrink from hardship, and who did not surrender her values to survive. White audiences, too, were captivated, though sometimes unsettled, by the unapologetic honesty of the Evans family's struggles. Yet, behind the applause, Rolle carried an inner tension. She had accepted the part on one condition, that the show would present a responsible, realistic view of Black life. In the early production meetings, she was adamant. If Florida is going to have children, then she must also have a husband, she insisted, because in our communities, strong families exist. Don't erase that truth for the sake of convenience. Her demands surprised the network executives, who had assumed they could sideline the father figure to simplify the scripts. Rolle's insistence eventually led to the casting of John Amos as James Evans, a move that gave the show its emotional core. But Rolle's passion often placed her at odds with the producers. She was not afraid to voice her disapproval when she felt the writing drifted toward buffoonery or empty laughs. Imagine a tense script meeting in which Rolle sat at the table, arms folded, silently glaring at a storyline that reduced the Evans family's struggles to a slapstick gag. "We cannot afford to make a mockery of this," she would say, her voice calm but edged with steel. In those moments, her colleagues learned that Esther Rolle was not just an actress. She was the moral compass of Good Times. Of course, such intensity created friction. One can almost picture the hushed conversations among writers after Rolle left the room. "She's right, but how do we keep the network happy?" The executives wanted ratings. Rolle wanted responsibility. This tug-of-war became the defining tension of the show, and in many ways, the engine that powered its greatness. Florida Evans was a triumph not only because of the words on the page, but because of the woman who embodied her. Rolle brought to the role a personal authenticity that no script could fully capture. She borrowed gestures from her own mother, folded prayers into her dialogue, and often improvised subtle expressions that spoke volumes about Florida's inner life. Audiences didn't just watch Good Times, they believed it. And yet, there is a fascinating what if to consider. What if Rolle had declined the role? What if she had grown weary of battling for representation and walked away before the pilot even aired? The landscape of American television might have been dramatically different. Without Florida Evans, Good Times could have devolved into a shallow sitcom, remembered, if at all, as another forgettable series of the 1970s. Instead, Rolle's commitment turned it into a cultural milestone, sparking conversations about poverty, racism, and resilience that continue to echo decades later. The irony, however, is that the very passion that made Rolle indispensable also sowed the seeds of conflict. As the show progressed, other characters began to take on more comedic weight, sometimes overshadowing the serious tone Rolle had fought to protect. Jimmie Walker's portrayal of J.J. Evans, with his exaggerated catchphrases and flamboyant humor, thrilled younger audiences but often clashed with Rolle's vision of grounded storytelling. She worried that the balance was tipping, that the hard-won dignity of Florida Evans was being diluted by cartoonish spectacle. When Good Times first aired, no one could have predicted that the character meant to provide comic relief would soon overshadow the matriarch at the show's heart. Jimmie Walker, as James J.J. Evans Jr., burst onto the screen with his lanky frame, flamboyant mannerisms, and that unforgettable catchphrase, "Dynamite." Almost overnight, it became a cultural phenomenon, repeated in classrooms, workplaces, and even parodied on late-night television. Walker, the unknown stand-up comic turned sitcom star, was suddenly the brightest light in the Good Times constellation. But for Esther Rolle, this meteoric rise was not a triumph. It was a tragedy. Rolle had envisioned Good Times as a platform for serious storytelling, a rare chance to shine a spotlight on the complexities of African American life. She fought to give the Evans family layers of dignity, resilience, and humanity. Yet, as J.J.'s antics grew wilder and his screen time ballooned, she feared the show was slipping into caricature. Instead of sparking empathy, it was eliciting cheap laughs. Laughs that, in her eyes, came at the expense of the very community she had sworn to represent. Behind the scenes, tension simmered. Cast and crew members would later recall the electric silence in the rehearsal room whenever Rolle and Walker found themselves on opposite ends of a creative disagreement. She would study him with the same piercing gaze she once reserved for producers, her silence speaking volumes. Walker, ever the comedian, would sometimes deflect with a joke, but Rolle wasn't laughing. For her, this wasn't comedy. It was cultural responsibility. Consider one imagined moment during a heated table read. Rolle pushes the script across the table, her voice steady but sharp. "This is not who we are," she declares, pointing to a scene where JJ bungles yet another opportunity for the sake of slapstick. The room goes quiet. Walker shrugs, muttering, "It's funny, though." And there it was, the fault line. To Walker, laughter equaled success. To Rolle, success meant truth. This ideological clash soon spilled into public perception. Magazine profiles began to center on Walker, dubbing him the breakout star, while Rolle was increasingly described as the stern disciplinarian of the show, both on screen and off. The irony was painful. The very seriousness that made her role groundbreaking now branded her as difficult, even old-fashioned, in an industry intoxicated by youthful humor. The real rupture came when Rolle could no longer reconcile her values with the show's direction. In 1977, she walked away. It was not a decision taken lightly. Friends recall how she wrestled with it, pacing her living room late into the night, asking herself if leaving would mean abandoning the very audience she had fought so hard to honor. But in the end, she concluded that staying would be a greater betrayal. If Good Times was going to turn into a circus, she would not be its reluctant ringmaster. Although the conflict between Esther Rolle and Jimmie Walker was never resolved, their combined presence gave Good Times its enduring legacy. Walker's irrepressible humor and Rolle's unyielding gravitas created a push and pull that, ironically, made the series unforgettable. Without Walker, the show might not have achieved its mainstream popularity. Without Rolle, it would never have had its heart. Together, even in conflict, they built something larger than either could have accomplished alone. A landmark series that forced American television to reckon with race, poverty, and dignity in ways it had previously ignored. For Esther Rolle, the legacy extended far beyond Nielsen ratings or catchphrases. Her true triumph lay in her steadfast refusal to compromise the dignity of her characters. She was not simply an actress playing Florida Evans. She was an advocate disguised as a performer, using her platform to demand fairness in the way Black life was depicted. In countless interviews, she returned to this theme. "We are more than jokes. We are more than tragedy. We are people those words, simple as they were, carried the weight of a mission." In the years following Good Times, Rolle continued to work steadily in film, television, and stage productions. She appeared in projects like Summer of My German Soldier and A Raisin in the Sun, consistently gravitating toward roles that carried substance and truth. She won an Emmy in 1979 for her performance in the television movie Summer of My German Soldier, a recognition that affirmed her belief that integrity, even when costly, could be rewarded. But Rolle's greatest impact was perhaps less visible. It was in the ripple effect of her example. Young Black actresses of the 1980s and 1990s often cited her as a pioneer. One can imagine a teenage Viola Davis or Angela Bassett watching Florida Evans on television and realizing for the first time that there was space for women who looked like them to embody strength and complexity on screen. In this sense, Rolle was not just an actress, but a pathbreaker, widening the road for those who would follow. Her later years, however, were not without struggle. Though respected, she was never a Hollywood darling in the conventional sense. Some producers viewed her as difficult, a label she carried simply because she demanded more than entertainment from her art. Friends recalled her joking about how many times she was told she was too serious for Hollywood. But in her private reflections, she seemed to wear that seriousness as a badge of honor. "Better serious than shallow," she once quipped in an imagined conversation with a fellow actor, sipping tea in her modest Florida home. By the late 1990s, Rolle's health had begun to decline. Yet even as illness crept in, she remained fiercely engaged with her community. She participated in local theater projects, spoke at colleges about representation, and mentored young performers who sought her guidance. Imagine her in a university lecture hall, frail but unbowed, telling a room full of students, "Don't let anyone laugh you out of your own truth. If you're not fighting for something, then you're just filling space." Her words landed like a challenge and a blessing. On November 17th, 1998, Esther Rolle passed away at the age of 78, just 9 days after her birthday. The news rippled quietly through Hollywood, but thundered in the hearts of those who had grown up with Florida Evans as their television mother. Fans left flowers outside CBS headquarters. Some organized small vigils in community centers, playing clips of Good Times and reciting Rolle's most iconic lines. At her funeral, attended by family, friends, and colleagues, John Amos, her on-screen husband, reportedly described her as the moral center not only of our show, but of our lives. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, what if Esther Rolle had lived longer? What if she had witnessed the 21st century explosion of black-led television, from Scandal to Blackish, and seen the fruits of the seeds she planted decades earlier? Would she have felt vindicated finally in her battle against caricature? Would she have smiled at the sight of complex, nuanced Black characters dominating primetime television in ways that once seemed impossible? Even in her absence, her spirit lingers. Florida Evans remains one of television's most enduring maternal figures, remembered not only for her stern lectures, but for her unwavering love, her quiet humor, and her refusal to break under pressure. To millions, she was more than a character. She was a reminder that dignity is possible even in the harshest of circumstances. Esther Rolle's legacy, therefore, is not confined to the annals of television history. It is alive in every actress who refuses to accept a stereotype, in every show that dares to portray marginalized communities with honesty, and in every viewer who finds courage in seeing their truth reflected on screen. In the end, her death did not close the book on her story. It only sealed her status as a pioneer whose life was defined by principle. And perhaps that is why, more than 2 decades later, her image still resonates. To this day, when audiences revisit Good Times and see Florida Evans battling poverty with grace and grit, they are not just watching fiction. They are witnessing Esther Rolle's philosophy in action, the belief that truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is always worth fighting for. The clash between Esther Rolle and Jimmie Walker was never just about 2 actors on a set. It was a microcosm of a larger struggle that continues to this day. The eternal tug-of-war between art as entertainment and art as truth, between fleeting laughter and enduring legacy. On one side stood Walker, embodying the charisma and comic timing that could electrify audiences in an instant. On the other was Rolle, who carried the weight of history on her shoulders, demanding that Good Times mean something beyond ratings. Their battle was not simply personal. It was philosophical, cultural, even moral. Looking back, it is easy to reduce their tension to a behind-the-scenes feud, the kind of gossip that fuels Hollywood lore. But in reality, what unfolded between Rolle and Walker symbolized a question still relevant today. What do we, as viewers, truly value in our entertainment? Are we content with cheap laughter that evaporates as soon as the credits roll? Or do we yearn for stories that challenge us, inspire us, and reflect the deeper truths of human experience? Imagine, for a moment, an alternate universe in which Esther Rolle's vision had triumphed completely. Picture Good Times evolving into a gritty, socially conscious drama, tackling issues like unemployment, systemic racism, and urban housing crises with raw honesty. Perhaps the show would have become television's answer to Roots, reshaping public discourse on race and inequality in the 1970s. In that timeline, Jimmie Walker might have adapted his comedic talent into subtler shades, blending humor with gravity, and the Evans family could have become the definitive portrait of Black America's resilience. But of course, reality played out differently. The producers leaned into Walker's catchphrases, audiences roared with laughter, and Rolle found herself increasingly isolated in her defense of integrity. The tension became too heavy to ignore, and eventually she chose principle over popularity. Yet therein lies the brilliance of her legacy. By walking away, she reminded the world that some battles are worth losing in the short term if the long-term victory is preserving dignity. Fast forward to today, and the echoes of that conflict are everywhere. We see it in debates about whether blockbuster films should prioritize box office spectacle or meaningful storytelling. We see it in the rise of viral comedy skits that rack up millions of views but fade within weeks, compared to slower, more thoughtful works that leave a lasting imprint. And we see it in the way certain actors, directors, and musicians still take stands, sometimes at great personal cost, to ensure their art says something real. If Esther Rolle were alive today, one imagines she would have much to say about our current media landscape. Perhaps she would shake her head at the endless stream of reality TV that trades dignity for drama. Perhaps she would find hope in series like Blackish or Queen Sugar, where complexity and cultural honesty take center stage. And perhaps, just perhaps, she would remind us, as she reminded her colleagues decades ago, that representation is not a luxury, but a responsibility. Her battle with Jimmie Walker was never healed, but in many ways, it doesn't need to be. Their creative conflict gave us a richer understanding of the stakes involved in storytelling. Rolle's uncompromising stance challenges us to reflect on our own choices as consumers of entertainment. Walker's comic energy reminds us that joy, too, is vital, even in the darkest of circumstances. Together, their push and pull became a parable. Art is always at its best when it wrestles with tension, even uncomfortable tension. So the question now is not whether Esther Rolle was right or wrong to resist Jimmie Walker's brand of humor. The question is, what do we want our stories to stand for? Will we reward art that settles for easy laughs, or will we support those who dare to risk popularity for the sake of truth? This is where you, the viewer, step in. Every time you click, share, or stream, you are casting a vote. You are choosing between the shallow and the profound, between entertainment that merely distracts and entertainment that endures. Esther Rolle's life reminds us that integrity often comes at a cost, but it is a cost worth paying if it means leaving behind something that matters. And so, as we close this journey into the fiery clash between Rolle and Walker, let's not remember it simply as a feud, but as a beacon. A reminder that art can be both entertaining and transformative, but only if we demand it. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it made you reconsider the shows you watch and the stars you admire, then let's keep this conversation alive. Subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and join us as we continue peeling back the curtain on Hollywood's most dramatic, untold stories. Because behind every laugh track, every award, every headline, there is always a deeper truth waiting to be uncovered. The legacy of Esther Rolle is not finished. It lives on in you, the audience. The choice is yours. Fleeting laughter or lasting truth.